And I'll broadcast. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to give a few seconds to let everyone get on in and get comfortable. I like to speak about Zoom as if we're in a real building. Come on and get seated. Good morning, good morning. Happy Friday. All right, so welcome to the research conference offered by CRQ. Today's session is titled Pipeline of Evidence Protocol Applied to Educational Initiatives, supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Before we get into the content, I do want to go over just a few housekeeping items. I know many of us have already used Zoom plenty this year, but just in case you need a quick reminder and haven't been in a webinar in a while, we do have the audio settings option down in the bottom corner. You can adjust your microphone and choose which way you'd like to join, whether that's through your phone or computer audio. Next, we have some functions down in the middle. You can see the chat option, the raise hand, and the closed caption options available to you. If you would like to chat and you want your chat to be to the participants or to the panelists only, you do have the drop down there, but if you wouldn't mind everyone seeing it, you can choose the option for all panelists and attendees. And finally, we do have a view options button here so that you may adjust the screen to fit how you'd like to in your window. Do note that we will leave some time for Q&A after the presentation. So feel free to type your questions in, but we will get to those towards the end of the session. I'd like to introduce briefly our presenters, Dr. Barbara Shermer and Dr. Allison Lockman. I will turn it over to you two now.
Okay, great. I'm going to begin. I want to thank all of you for attending our presentation. I'm Barbara Shermer. Let me first introduce my co-presenter, Allison, who is on screen. Allison has a bachelor's degree in astrophysics from Swarthmore College, a master's degree in astronomy from the University of Virginia, and PhD in education from the Ohio State University. She has been a contributing faculty and lead faculty at Walden since 2009. As I said, I'm Barbara Shermer. I'm not on screen today, in large part because just a week ago I had surgery and I just am not screen ready. I have a bachelor's degree in elementary education from the University of Buffalo, master's degree in teaching deaf and hard of hearing children from the University of Pittsburgh, and an EDD degree from the University of Buffalo. I've been a tenured professor of education and administrator at several universities, most recently provost and vice president for academic affairs at the College of St. Rose in Albany, New York. I've been a contributing faculty member at Walden since 2015. Allison and I have collaborated on several research studies. The study we are presenting today is part of our line of research inquiry on evidence-based practices and essential elements for educational research. We actually have a third co-author, and that is Dr. Todd Shermer, who is Division Director for Forensic Criminal Justice, the Behavioral Health and Recovery Services of Marin County Health and Human Services in San Rafael, California. The study we're presenting today was recently published in the International Journal of Educational Methodology. Okay, we can go to the next slide, please. At the time we began this study, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation had provided $41.3 billion in grant support to numerous initiatives designed to improve the lives of vulnerable population since its founding in 2000. The goal of their K-12 initiatives has been to ensure that all students receive an education that enables them to pursue post-secondary education, attain successful careers, and achieve social mobility and personal fulfillment. Given the substantial size of grant funding, the publicity surrounding the initiatives selected by the foundation, and controversy about the influence of a private foundation on trends in K-12 education, it is important to identify the bases for decisions by the foundation for its funding priorities and whether the initiatives reflect scientific evidence indicating the likelihood of successful outcomes. Since the first K-12 grant-funded initiative in 2006, outcomes have been mixed. Given the influence of Gates funding on K-12 education in the US, it is important to determine whether their selection process or design of the initiative offers reasons for successes and failures. The process used by the Gates Foundation for deciding which initiatives to fund from among the many ideas that are brought to the Foundation's attention is not published. However, it is possible to retroactively examine the prior research that led to the selection and design of initiatives supported by Gates Foundation grant funding. So, for such an examination, we use the framework of line of research inquiry, which connotes building a body of knowledge from study to study. The Institute of Education Sciences and National Science Foundation protocol enables determination of how particular methodological designs in a line of research inquiry provides converging evidence for each successive step in the process of bringing any given instructional intervention into practice. We use this protocol as our framework. So the purpose of our study was to investigate the applicability of the Institute of Education Sciences, National Science Foundation, pipeline of evidence protocol as a framework to ascertain why two notable educational initiatives spearheaded and financially supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation achieved or not the goal of improved educational outcomes for K-12 public school students. And now I'll turn it over to Allison.
And can we have a new slide, please? Thank you. We used a qualitative methodological design to explore the narrative data on these two Gates Foundation initiatives. All data sources were cited in Gates reports about each initiative. So we didn't identify sources that the Gates Foundation might have considered when deciding on a given initiative. Instead, we only reviewed the sources that Gates did consider. Our goal was to examine the empirical evidence for the two Gates initiatives and then map this evidence to the research categories in the IES-NSF pipeline of evidence. We found the empirical evidence in program evaluation reports conducted by independent evaluators at the American Institutes for Research. The data sources included the two program evaluation reports and the research studies that were cited within each report. New slide, please. So our first step was to select the initiatives. We chose the first one, Intensive Partnership for Effective Teaching, and the second was the Early College High School initiatives for two reasons. One is that the initiatives had been in effect for enough time to determine if they were sufficiently successful for the Gates Foundation to continue support and expand funding beyond the initial phase of patronage. The second reason is that each had been highly touted as having the potential to be a disruptive innovation in education at their launch. The goal of the first one, Intensive Partnership for Effective Teaching, which we're going to refer to here on in as teacher evaluation, the goal of that was to improve high school graduation and college attendance rates among low-income minority students by improving the effectiveness of their teachers. So each educational site was expected to develop a measure of teaching effectiveness that included the teacher's contribution to growth in student achievement, sometimes referred to as value added, and then also the assessment of teaching based on classroom observations. Each site was then expected to use assessment data to improve recruitment and hiring practices, ensure that low-income minority students receive the most effective teachers, reform tenure and dismissal policies so that the most effective teachers were advanced and ineffective teachers were removed, link professional development to teachers' weaknesses, and also to add financial and promotion incentives to retain the most effective teachers. The second initiative, the Early College High School Initiative, which we will refer to as Early College, their goal was to increase the opportunity for underserved students to earn an associate's degree or up to 2 years of college credits applicable to a bachelor's degree while they were still in high school. Early colleges were expected to involve a partnership between high schools and post-secondary institutions, to be committed to serving underrepresented students, to establish an integrated academic program that would enable students to earn 1 or 2 years of transferable college credit, and also offer support to help develop students' academic, social, and behavioral skills that were necessary for college success. Next slide, please. So our second step involved examining the prior research that led to the design of those two initiatives. We examined the empirical evidence and program evaluations conducted for the Gates Foundation. For our third step, we mapped this evidence to the steps in the IES-NSF pipeline of evidence protocol. And the protocol works as follows. As you can see on your screen, there are 6 sort of phases of research. So research type 1, foundational, involves studies that provide foundational knowledge of teaching and learning. They develop and refine theory and examine phenomena in the absence of a direct link to educational outcomes. Research type 2 is early stage or exploratory. That involves studies that examine the connections or relationships among constructs that may result in the development of a new intervention. Research type 3 is design and development, involves studies that draw on theory and empirical evidence in designing an intervention and testing individual components. Research type 4, efficacy, involves studies that test the intervention under ideal circumstances. Research type 5, effectiveness, involves studies that test the intervention under more typical circumstances. And then research type 6, scale up, involves studies that test the intervention under typical circumstances, but in a wide range of contexts and populations. Next slide, please. So we use this IES-NSF protocol as the a priori scheme for deductive coding. Each of us first reviewed the 2 program evaluation reports and then reviewed the sources cited in each of these reports that were identified as supporting the decision to launch each initiative. Each of us then explored these documents by first reading through them for an overall sense of the content and then writing out notes for each during a more careful follow-up readings. The a priori scheme enabled us to focus on the characteristics of foundational, early stage or exploratory, design and development, efficacy, effectiveness, and scale up research, and then match those characteristics to the design of each study. To address potential issues of trustworthiness, we employed strategies to ensure credibility, transferability, dependability, and conformability. We engaged in research reflexivity by considering our assumptions, beliefs, values, and biases that could have influenced our interpretation of the data. We kept an audit trail to provide tracking of questions, insights, and decisions during our data analysis. And we independently analyzed the corpus of data and then compared our findings, discussed discrepancies, and also then reached consensus for each study. Next slide, please. All right. So here's what we found. First, I'll talk about the teacher evaluation initiative. So each teacher evaluation site was expected to follow a theory of action by specifying steps and implementing changes to the site's approach to teacher evaluation and a plan for evaluating outcomes. The constructs of the theory of action included, first, a valid measure of teacher effectiveness, also staffing policies that linked the measure of teacher effectiveness to hiring, placement, retention, and dismissal decisions. Third, customized professional development to meet the needs of individual teachers, and then also compensation and career ladder policies for teachers. So the conclusion was that no actual theory underlay the initiative that reflected research type 1. Research on the relationships between aspects of teacher performance and student achievement were identified as early stage or exploratory research, which is research type 2. Findings from this body of research indicated that multiple measures of teacher performance, with or without incentives, did improve outcomes. 3 lines of research influenced the design and development of the teacher assessments used in the teacher evaluation initiative. This is research type 3. First, benefits of multiple measures of teacher effectiveness versus any single measure as predictive of student achievement growth. Second, acceptability of evaluation measures to the teachers. Third, the reliability and validity of feedback from student surveys and teacher observation protocols. There were no studies testing the intervention under ideal circumstances, which would be research type 4, or typical circumstances, which was research type 5, prior to scaling up the interventions in a wide range of contexts and populations, which was, of course, research type 6 for this teacher evaluation initiative. So next slide, please. So the teacher evaluation initiative did not lead to gains in student achievement, graduate rates, and post-school outcomes. Instead, results showed that most teachers were rated in the higher categories of effectiveness. Sites had difficulty recruiting effective teachers to high-need schools. Just 1% of teachers were dismissed for poor performance. Sites were unable to individualize professional development based on teacher evaluations. Modifications to compensation policies to reward effective teaching did not lead to more effective teachers being placed in higher need schools. The salary gap between more and less effective teachers did not change, and new career ladder policies did not increase retention of the most effective teachers. Next slide, please. Next, I will discuss the Early College Initiative. The Early College Initiative was based on foundational principles that included high school rigor to build content knowledge and learning skills, relevance of the high school curriculum for making real-world connections for students, and relationships with instructors and peers during high school to support engagement and achievement. This all connects to research type 1. Research on the relationships among constructs in the Early College Initiative, so research type 2, involved the relationship between college degree attainment and wages, showing that each level of post-secondary education adds a significant amount to lifetime earnings, and also the relationship between college degree attainment and demographic characteristics, which shows a significantly lower degree of attainment for individuals from underrepresented populations and from economically disadvantaged families. Research on dual enrollment programs, which involve college courses taken by high school students on a high school or a college campus, offers evidence of designing the intervention and testing components. So this is research type 3. These dual credit courses have been found to both promote college enrollment through access to college level academic and technical courses while in high school, and also to be associated with greater high school persistence and college degree completion. The research on dual enrollment programs also reflects efficacy research for the early college component of college level coursework. So this is research type 4. As previous research showed that the informal recruitment typical of dual enrollment programs resulted in a lack of diversity among the students, the Early College Initiative incorporated targeted recruitment of diverse students. We found no studies that involved the testing of the initiative under typical circumstances within one or a few highly controlled settings. So that's research type 5, again, prior to scaling up through Gates funding. Next slide, please. According to the evaluation report, students were significantly more likely to graduate high school, enroll in college, and earn a college degree from early college high schools than comparison students. The comparison students reflected similar demographics to the early college students, but attended larger high schools with fewer academic supports and less direct attention to college readiness than the early college high schools. Next slide, please.
Great, I think it's my turn.
Yeah, back to you.
Okay, so we began this study with the question of whether the IES-NSF pipeline of evidence protocol is applicable in ascertaining why two notable educational initiatives, spearheaded and financially supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, achieved or not the goal of improved educational outcomes for K-12 public school students. We focused on whether the teacher evaluation and early college initiatives had a research base for effectiveness that had emerged from an accumulation of empirical evidence and identification of conceptual or theoretical frameworks. We want to emphasize that our interest was not whether there actually is a sufficient body of high quality research evidence to support these two initiatives, but rather whether the research considered by the Gates Foundation established the likelihood that the initiatives would be successful and worth the decision to dedicate substantial funding, time, and effort required for each versus the many competing programs seeking sponsorship. We found that in the case of teacher evaluation, foundational efficacy and effectiveness research were absent, and the Gates Foundation ultimately discontinued grant support because the initiative had not accomplished the goal of improved high school graduation and college attendance rates among low-income minority students. In the case of early college, we found empirical evidence was manifest at all but the effectiveness stage of the pipeline. The Gates Foundation continues to provide support to this initiative, and the numbers of early colleges continue to be increased. In a prior study of applying the IES-NSF pipeline of evidence protocol, we, meaning myself and Allison and Dr. Shermer, the other Dr. Shermer, we applied the protocol to assess whether two literacy instructional practices touted as having a research base for effectiveness have emerged from an accumulation of empirical evidence and identification of conceptual or theoretical frameworks. Our results from that study indicated that the protocol did indeed offer a productive approach to identifying evidence-based practices because it took into account the role of methodological designs in lines of research inquiry. Next slide, please. Thank you. We suggest that our results show the promise for this approach to identifying the likelihood of success for any new educational practice. Rather than leaping from good idea to scale-up interventions, our findings underlie the importance of a line of research inquiry that provides researchers, practitioners, policymakers, federal agencies, and private foundations with a pipeline of evidence for designing and implementing interventions with the likelihood of effectiveness in diverse educational environments. However, the approach is dependent on transparency of the body of research considered when a new intervention is launched. Despite the role of private foundations in the US for shaping K-12 educational practices through grant funding, their decision-making process is proprietary and not available for those outside the foundation to scrutinize and critique the research that informed the design of initiatives. Our findings support the importance of widening the net of methodologies that constitutes a framework for elements needed to make predictions of effectiveness for any given intervention before investing in scale-up initiatives. Our study is clearly limited in a few ways. It is limited by the lack of transparency regarding the process used by the Gates Foundation for selecting initiatives, and also certainly by the two initiatives we examined. It may be that others implemented at about the same time as the two we investigated would reveal different evidence bases before launch and different trajectories subsequently. It may also be that the process for selecting initiatives has subsequently been modified, and those launched more recently have been selected only after research at each stage in the pipeline indicates scaling up is the next logical step. We do not suggest that methodology is the only factor that may explain the differential success of the two initiatives. We recognize that whenever an intervention is scaled up, there will be intervening variables affecting the outcome. As with all research, replication is needed to affirm or disconfirm findings. And we're happy to take your questions now at this point.
Thank you both so much for that presentation. As individuals get their questions together, I did want to kind of toss out a question for you both. Beyond the results of the study, what was either or both of you's biggest takeaway or maybe a surprising aspect of the study that you found?
So I think that first of all, we were surprised at how how difficult it was to really get primary information about the research that had led to the selection of those initiatives. So I think it was sort of that first step what was surprising to us. Because of our prior study, we were not surprised any longer that having research at each stage of the pipeline of evidence that was put together agreed upon by IES and NSF as important stages of research, we were not surprised that when you miss stages and you don't, that there's no available, there appears to be no available research at, let's say, an exploratory stage or an efficacy stage, it was no longer a surprise to us that didn't bode well for the initiative being successful.
I would agree. I would piggyback on exactly what you just said, that missing stages, I think at first that was surprising to me that some of the stages would be missing. But clearly that was the case.
And I would be curious what some of the participants think. This really gets at a little bit of what I've seen as a teacher and a researcher over the years, and I'm sure Allison agrees, is that you see a lot of ideas come and go. Sometimes they stay for quite a while. Some of them have research behind them, some of them do not. Some of them may have some research behind some of the stages in that pipeline. And it gets at that issue of what I believe, why is it that, what is it that professionals, practitioners are bringing to the table that say, even if there's an issue with research supporting the effectiveness of a particular strategy or intervention, what is it that keeps that one going? And what is it that, versus those that sort of get hot for a while and then disappear after a while because, practitioners are on to the next thing. And that's just one of those, ever-ending curiosities that those of us who engage more in research than in frontline teaching in K-12 are very interested in, because we like, obviously, practitioners to, attend more to research findings for effectiveness. But what is it that says, my own experience with a particular strategy is more important to me than your findings?
Thank you both for responding to that. It's always nice to get the researchers' perspective beyond what the results do show. I'll give just another minute to see. Oh, great. Larissa says and then asks, as educators and researchers, based upon the findings of this study, what is the most essential aspect for a potential applicant for a Bill and Melinda Gates grant to keep in mind when applying for a grant?
So that's really not, I have to be honest, we were impossible to uncover what would lead one to know which major initiatives they were looking for at any given time. That was just not in the kind of research that Allison and I did. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation provides typically very large grants, and they tend to embark, at least this is from an observer's point of view, and tend to embark on major initiatives, at least if they're involving K-12, but even all their initiatives, they tend to involve large sums of money, multiple sites. They don't start small. They tend to, that's why they were so interesting to study from this regard. They don't really start small. They start big. They start in multiple places, and they fund well in those places. It's not, so it's very difficult if you, unless you develop an in, let's say at the foundation, talk through with their program officers what they're most looking for, you know, right now in terms of ideas. But remember, there's hundreds, thousands of foundations out there. And some foundations are clearly much more modest and much easier to start smaller with smaller initiatives. So I would say, you know, in terms of, and I've gotten foundation grants. I've not gotten foundation grants in the past. You know, try to, you know, work with their program officers to figure out what is it they're looking for and what size of grants are they interested in supporting and what are the general kind of topics.
It looks like Larissa added, if possible, a potential hypothetical response. Oh, okay, so this is kind of what you have already went over. All right, thank you for that response, Dr. Shermer.
Sure.
We'll give just another minute to see if any other questions come in, since we're still a little bit before time. All right. I don't see any other questions at this moment, but again, as shared at the beginning, you can be sure to contact either of the presenters if needed. And thank you all so much. Thank you to the presenters for your research and embarking on social change through education, and to all of our attendees.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.